Today I'm going to show you how I decorated this Princess Peach cake. Come join me. So this cake is a 2-tier cake. It's chocolate on both tiers. It's a 6-inch and a 4-inch. So prior to actually decorating, I had to do some of the decorating in fondant. Had to create the pieces in advance to let them dry and harden so they'd be prepared. So here I am creating the crown that's going to go on top of the cake. So as you can see, I'm just cutting out the crown pieces, and I'm going to let this harden over several days. Here I'm creating some tiny ball pieces that'll go on top of each one of the peaks of this crown. I'm using toothpicks to hold them into place on top of the peaks because they are difficult to stay in place. And once this is done, I'm just going to let this sit as it's sitting here, and it'll sit until it's hardened. I use some Tylose powder to help keep that hardened as well, but it will be nice and solid in time to just sit on top of the cake, nice and sturdy. I'll also use some toothpicks the day of to help brace it into the top of the cake. So there I'm just straightening it out, and I just put it aside. So here I'm making some just bubble pieces of fondant that will have some writing on the side. One will have a happy birthday message, and then one will have a message that says peach is greater than DK or Donkey Kong, and that will be put aside also. Here I am making some borders or bead borders for the base of the cake that will go on the bottom of each of the 2 tiers. And then as you can see, I'm just kind of using that mold, and then I'm cutting them out. And then I'll put those aside too for the day of when the cake is ready to be assembled. So these ones I do not want to get hardened, so I'll put them into a plastic bag, and that will keep them from getting hard, and they'll still be pliable on the day that I'm ready to put the cake together. You can see I'm just kind of measuring to see how many of these I will need for the actual cake. Here I'm making kind of some ribbons or other molds that will go along the top of each one of the 2 tiers. And again, I'm using the mold, cutting them out, then I'll put them into a plastic bag so that way they don't get hard. That way I can move them around on the day that I am going to put the cake together. And again, I'm using a pan the size of the cake to see how many of these I'll need on the day of assembly. Here I am making some little, they're going to be gems that will go along the top of the cake, along the sides of the cake, and also on the crown. You'll see I use some saran wrap. That gives a kind of like a beveled look, so it's more rounded on the edges, so not so sharp edged. And I'm just going to put those aside. You'll see in a moment that I'm going to use some piping gel to then paint over these, and that way they will be nice and shiny, and they'll look like little jewels put onto the, the, the crown and on the side of the cake. And here's where I'm using that piping gel just to give it a nice shine. And I'll put those aside and let those dry until the day of assembly as well. So here we are. Now the crown is hardened, and I am adding these jewels to the crown. And this is not the day of assembly, but this is like a few days before, a day or two before, so that the jewels have time to set onto the crown, and that way they're secure the day I'm ready to handle the crown itself, to put it together on the cake. All right, so here I am beginning to put the cake together. I'm using some buttercream onto the cake board to hold that cake in place. And I'm going to now begin to fill and stack this cake. I'm just making sure here that the whole cake is covered for the crumb coats, so that we have a nice clean canvas on to work with once we begin to decorate. Now we're beginning to do the next tier, again using some buttercream to hold that cake down, and I'm beginning to stack this cake as well. Back to the first one. Now that the crumb coat's done, I'm doing the final icing coat, making sure that it's nice and crisp and smooth, because this is, the whole cake is going to be covered in fondant, so I need to make sure that this is very smooth, because the fondant will pick up any bumps or creases that are in the final coat of icing. So it's really important that it's very smooth and straight. Now we're doing the final coat for the top layer, or I'm sorry, the top tier. And again, making sure that it's very smooth and very crisp on the edges. Now I'm using large pieces of pink fondant. I'm rolling it very thin, and I'm going to cover each of these with pieces of fondant. So you can see I'm just kind of lifting and pulling, lifting and pulling, lifting, pulling, until this cake is covered with fondant, cutting off the excess here and just continuing to lift and pull until the cake is covered with the fondant. And then I'll cut off all the excess that's along the bottom of the cake. And I'm using a fondant smoother along the top and sides of the cake to just make sure that it's nice and smooth. I'll do this exact same process on the smaller cake once I'm finished with this. Here I was just kind of pushing out any air bubbles that might be on the top or sides of the cake. Again, lift and pull to cover the sides of the cake. Using the fondant smoother and smoothing that out, trying to get this more squared at the top. It's smaller, it's a little more difficult for me with a smaller cake, but doing my best to get that nice and crisp on the edges up at the top of the cake. Okay, now we're going to begin to put this cake together on the day before pickup. So I'm using those pieces that I put together previously. So I'm putting that bottom border, cutting off the excess. And now I'm using some dowels to put in the bottom tier to make sure that the top cake doesn't fall into the bottom cake. So I'm using it's a 4-inch cake going on top, so I need 5 small dowels into the bottom to make sure that, as I mentioned, the cake doesn't fall into itself. Then I'm filling each one of those straw dowels with some icing for extra support. And then I'm putting that smaller cake on top. And then I'm going to use a larger skewer. Here I am pulling out a small piece of that fondant, which I'll replace once I'm finished with putting this skewer stick into the center to hold the whole cake together. Pounding that in through, and then I'm going to cut off the excess off the top. Then I'm going to put that piece of fondant that I just took off back on and putting one of those jewels that I made on top to kind of cover it. And now I'm adding those ribbons that I had made previously along the side of the cake to drape down over that bottom tier. Putting that layer of border or beading along the top tier. Just kind of pushing it down to cover in some of those gaps that you can see. And then putting in some of the jewels to additionally cover those gaps. And now I'm putting the ribbon up along the top, those banners, to drape down over the top tier. And again, adding those jewels at the meeting points. Here I am, I'm cleaning up the crown using a little bit of Crisco to brush off the excess powdered sugar that remains on the crown to make it nice and shiny. Checking to see what it's going to look like, but really just kind of placing everything in place to see what will be the final product. I'm going to add some additional jewels along the bottom to hide some of the creases. There, I was just kind of looking to see how I could hide the crease that's inside the crown where it joined together. And now I'm going to add those bubbles that say the happy birthday message and also the Peach is greater than Donkey Kong message that the customer wanted. And there's the final product. This is what it looked like once it was finished. If you enjoyed this video, I encourage you to like, comment, share, and subscribe so that you don't miss any future content. Thank you so much for joining me, and this is the final product. Again, thank you so much for joining us. Please come again to see future content. Have a great day.